Hello. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our Demystifying the DOJ presentation. My name is Efrain Boteo Cisneros, and I'm a community outreach specialist for the Central Valley at the Office of Community Awareness, Response, and Engagement, also known as CARE for short. I'll be moderating today's presentation, which we hope will provide some useful information about the work the California Department of Justice is doing to prevent gun violence. Before we begin with the presentation, I'd like to share a little bit about the Office of CARE. Our office was launched in July of 2021 with the following goals: to build relationships with California's communities, particularly with those who have historically been marginalized and underrepresented, to ensure DOJ's policies and programs are directly informed by the needs of all Californians, and to develop knowledge and awareness amongst the public and community organizations of DOJ's mission and actions on behalf of the people of California. This Demystifying the DOJ presentation series aims to do just that. We aim to develop knowledge and awareness of DOJ's resources and programs, and these webinars are good opportunities to learn directly from DOJ staff and ask questions regarding the work of DOJ's various divisions, sections, bureaus, and offices. Today is our third 2023 presentation in this series, and we'll be discussing the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. In just a bit, we will begin our presentation, which will be followed by a Q&A opportunity for you to ask your questions. My colleague, Marco Briones, will be adding a brief agenda in the chat for your reference. You will hear from two very knowledgeable experts in gun violence prevention. First, we're going to hear from Special Assistant Attorney General Michael Reddy, who serves as a top policy advisor to Attorney General Bonta on gun violence-related matters. After that, we're going to hear from the director of our Office of Gun Violence Prevention, Ari Freilich. After their respective presentations, we'll have time for Q&A. Throughout the presentation, please share your questions in the Q&A box on your screen so that we can collect them and answer them after the presentation. If you have a question for a specific presenter, please specify that in your question. If you shared questions in the registration form, they have been shared with our presenters, and we hope to have addressed most of them in the presentation. If we have time, we'll also try to ask some of them in the Q&A live at the end. Thank you for sending them to us ahead of time. We will also send the presentation slides in an accessible format for those who have requested it in the registration form by email. And lastly, if you are joining us today as a reporter or affiliated with the press, please identify your news outlet if you are asking a question in the Q&A box. Now, with that, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Special Assistant Attorney General Michael Reddy. Michael, please take it away.
Great. Thank you. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And as somebody who cares very much about this issue, it's wonderful to see so many people who share that interest. So yeah, I'm Michael. Exactly. I'm a special assistant, which is sort of a fancy way of saying that I'm tasked with bringing the Attorney General's vision to bear. I joined the Department of Justice 2 years ago, shortly after the Attorney General became the Attorney General. And one of the policy issues that it was important to the AG to have somebody focusing on, and I'm fortunate enough to be that person, is gun violence and is firearms. So the Department of Justice has a wide array of groups, people looking at this issue. The Bureau of Firearms does enforcement work and is active in what's called our APPS program, our Armed Prohibited Persons system. And they're going and taking firearms away from people who have been deemed too dangerous to possess those firearms. Our government law attorneys are defending firearms legislation in court. And then our Office of Legislative Affairs are active in looking at different policy solutions and trying to pitch legislation to address firearm violence. When the Attorney General came in, again, this was one of his top priorities, and he wanted to look at all the different ways that we are working to prevent firearm violence, and what are the ways that we could do better. That's really what was the genesis of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. We looked at all of that and said, everybody's doing incredible work, but we know there's so much more that could be done, and we wanted to get more involved in that. The three pillars that I think the office is really based on is data, dialogue, and delivery. So data, if you're a policymaker right now, you are inundated in a good way with data, whereas 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, a piece of legislation would pass and you wouldn't necessarily know, is it effective or not? If you look at a lot of our data really goes back to the 1960s when we say, this is the highest or lowest homicide rate that we've seen. There's always a little asterisk after that that says, when data began to be collected, which was about 1960. So we're really living in a time where we have access to so much more information and we can pass legislation and see the effects. And Ari has a presentation, which he's going to go into later, which will show some of the effects, and they're very stark. So we wanted to have an office that would be able to look at that data, assess that data, and sort of say, what do we do with this? The second pillar after data is really dialogue. There are so many folks who are doing this work up and down the state, from community-based organizations. Yesterday, we were at Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles doing incredible work, to the statewide level. The California Department of Public Health has again, a vast array of resources and folks who are looking at this issue from every angle and trying to reduce firearm homicide, firearm violence. And so we really wanted to be in dialogue with them. We understood the work that they're doing, how important it was, and wanted to really have a seat at the table and say, we think that we have something to bring here. And we want to be a part of the work that everybody else is doing. So we wanted to be in dialogue with everybody. And then after data and dialogue is really delivery. And I think the best way that I put that is that, sometimes as policymakers, we, do a very good job of implementing the laws as they're written. But sometimes we can lose sight of what the ultimate goal is, meaning, our firearms laws are here for a purpose, and that is to reduce the firearm homicide and violent rate. And so we really wanted to have an office that was going to be focused on that and taking a step back and saying, is what we're doing working? If not, why not? If so, how do we replicate it? How do we encourage it? How do we promote it? So I think those are sort of the three things that brought about the genesis of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. And at the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, we are extremely fortunate to have Ari Freilich, who comes to us from Giffords Law Center, where he worked for many years and was an expert in all kinds of community-based violence intervention programs. His resume is sort of a dizzying list of all the different firearms knowledge that a person could have. So we're extremely fortunate to have him here. He came before them from AMVETS Legal Clinic and Military Law Institute, as a graduate of Stanford Law School and Cornell. Ari, welcome.
Thanks, great to be with you.
Great.
Thanks to the CARE office for organizing today.
Right. Good. So Ari, we're going to talk a little bit about the office, but before I ask you some questions about the office generally, just wanted to ask, could you provide the viewers here today a little bit of a background? What is community violence intervention, and how does it interplay with other efforts to reduce firearm violence?
Sure. Yeah. So we received a lot of questions about this. So I'm glad we're starting off here. Community violence intervention is an umbrella term for a variety of largely non-punitive strategies that work to identify people at highest risk and interrupt cycles of violence, injury, trauma, and retaliation. As we'll talk about a little bit more in the data report presentation, perhaps surprisingly, about 3/4 of people who are victims of gun assault shootings in our state survive. The marvels of modern medicine can repair their physical wounds, but then we have thousands of people across our state every year who survive that life-altering trauma, a near attempted murder, bullets shot into their bodies, and then they are sent right back into their community in the same desperate circumstances that led to their shooting in the first place. Often with untreated trauma, and where we know in the vast majority of cases nationwide, their shooter will not be arrested and may remain at large. So it should not be surprising then that they are at very high risk of being shot again. And for some, of being involved in cycles of vigilante retaliatory violence too. So what community violence intervention programs and professionals do is work to identify those people at highest risk and deploy credible, authentic messengers who can break through and connect them with a range of services and supports that make them safer and can save their life, that can support them on the pathway to trauma recovery, and that can also help reduce the risk that they'll be involved in retaliatory violence too. So these are programs that are designed to proactively, assertively engage people at highest risk and break the cycle of violence. They have, I think it's fair to say, been chronically underfunded and undervalued, and that's starting to change. And the Attorney General has been a longstanding champion of those programs, and they'll have a champion in this office too.
Great. So specifically then on that, can you tell us a little bit about what the mission of the office is, and now that you're at the helm, what your vision is for the office?
Sure, yeah. So I think that the formal mission statement is something like the Attorney General Bonta established this office to support data and impact-driven efforts, like you're saying, Michael, to effectively and equitably prevent gun violence and related traumas. And I think the plain English version of that is that we're a small team, but our charge is to be as helpful as we can to as many people as we can across the state and other states, working to prevent gun violence and related harms. Especially focused on implementation of our laws, effective coordination to break down silos, and to be a liaison outside of government with survivors, advocates, groups who are often left out of the conversation and off the table. We want to recognize, I think, as a foundation that California has been a leader in building a track record of action. So we've had a lot of new laws and responsibilities, ongoing efforts to come back at this and strengthen our approaches. And that's great. And our data report will show that there's been significant long-term reductions in gun violence as a result. And with those ongoing positive opportunities for safety are also ongoing responsibilities and challenges for effective implementation, for coordination, for ensuring that public understands what's working and what isn't, and what opportunities there are. So we hope to essentially recognize that passing a new law, passing a new program is the start. So often, not the finish line, and to be as helpful as we can in the process of implementing it and ensuring, as you said, that those laws, those new programs have as much impact in the real world as possible to save as many people as we can.
Great. No, that's fantastic. So now that you provided exactly a little bit of a basis of what this work is and what the larger mission of the office is, can you talk about some of the specific priorities that you have and that the Attorney General has for the office? What are sort of the down to brass tacks type of work that you're hoping to get involved in?
Yeah, big topic. So I'll try to be brief and then kind of just talk about a few top key early priorities. And I think the first I mentioned a bit is on community violence intervention. This is an exciting time for the field of community violence intervention work. There's, for the first time in a long time, I think significant renewed interest at the state and federal level in investing in this work. Creating new opportunities to fund and build and scale up that work to serve more people and intervene as much as possible in cycles of violence. There's also a lot of opportunities and challenges with scaling up, with tapping into temporary new funding streams, learning about them, figuring out the red tape, and also building this out into the more permanent public health and safety infrastructure of our state. So programs aren't relying on short-term hiring, short-term planning, but can actually really build out as we can have more of a permanent expectation that people who have been victims of violence, who are at high risk of violence, will receive services designed to make them safer, promote their trauma recovery, and reduce risk of violent retaliation. A second, I think, key area of focus is on protection orders. So this is another tool for intervening and in many different variety of cases. California has been a leader in creating opportunities for people to go into a court, present evidence to a judge that someone is a clear danger to themselves or others, and get a court order that can increase safety. So an example is it's often called a red flag law, a gun violence restraining order law. California was a leader in creating one of the first comprehensive gun violence restraining order laws in the country. That's especially useful in preventing mass shootings that may have generalized risk to the public, suicide, where a protection order is not as appropriate. But we also have been a leader in creating a lot of other options, putting a lot of other tools in the toolkit for orders that can allow someone who's experiencing threats of violence and abuse and harassment, stalking, sexual assault, to go into a court and get a court order that automatically prohibits the abusive party from accessing firearms and orders them to physically stay away from and not contact the victim, along with other safety protections. there appear to be some significant uneven, I'd say, disparities in different counties, jurisdictions about awareness and utilization of these approaches. So we want to make sure that people have as much information as possible to choose the right tool in the toolkit for the right time to act for safety. And a related key priority, I think, is on firearm relinquishment. So a lot of the national conversation about gun violence prevention focuses on who can purchase and acquire weapons, who has such a significant history of violence that they should be ineligible, and do we have background check requirements to ensure that they wouldn't be able to purchase one. Less attention often goes to kind of the reverse situation where someone already has weapons and then becomes legally ineligible to keep them. Maybe they were convicted of a serious crime, became subject to a domestic violence restraining order. This is a bit personal to me. People I know and love are probably alive today because the system worked for them. They went into court, they got a restraining order against an abusive person, and the system worked to disarm that person at a critical time of crisis and threat. And we want to make sure that our systems are working, that people aren't falling through the gaps, and that firearms are recovered as close to the time as a prohibition as possible to ensure that people don't remain illegally armed in our communities. A related point is on victims' access to justice. Last year, the Attorney General sponsored legislation. I was proud to be part of it to expand gun violence victims' rights to seek justice in court. That's been part of a national movement to promote gun violence victims' rights. Public officials can also utilize this law to file civil suits against firearm industry members who violate the law and cause harm. And so I think ensuring that the public has the understanding they need, that public officials have the understanding they need to utilize this law where appropriate to seek fair justice in court will be a key priority. And then lastly, I want to lift up that there's a lot of really interesting legislation happening this year, and really important litigation work happening to defend what California has built. And so a key priority for our Office of Gun Violence Prevention is working with all the other DOJ teams you mentioned to ensure we're doing everything we can to inform and be informed by all those legislative efforts, and to ensure that our laws are upheld in court and can continue to work.
Yeah, that's great. And I would just add that one of the things that the Attorney General talks about from time to time is exactly how all of this work complements each other. And sometimes the question is asked, did this law, did this bill, did this program reduce violence? And the answer is sometimes it's really hard to look at something in isolation and say, this is what made the difference in a particular case. But when you add up, and I know you're about to go into some of that, when you add up the different effects of what we're doing, it has made a very stark difference. And as you said, that difference is tangible. It's not just data. It's actually people's lives, people that are alive today. I came to this work, or come to this work as a prosecutor, and exactly what you talked about with the different types of orders. That was something that was both frustrating as a prosecutor, and also really enlightening, because as a prosecutor, you have a limited array of tools, but one of the things that you start to do is become familiar with the different types of tools. So when you talk about the different protective orders that are available, again, it really, California is on the cutting edge of so much in terms of firearm prevention, firearm violence prevention, and exactly knowing those orders and becoming somebody that was familiar with it, and having victims come in and say, well, we might not be at the point where we can prosecute a criminal case, but there are all these other available options for you. Again, there's just such a wide array of things that are available. So, very happy to have you here to be able to help spread that message. We talked a little bit about this, but I do want to ask, and the question came in, and then I'll ask one more question, but is really, how do you envision the office supporting and lifting up the work of community-based organizations who are doing this kind of work?
Yeah, so I think the short answer is some of this it may be affected by legislation that's pending in the legislature now. There are bills that would permanently extend the CalVIT program, for instance, and formalize a role for DOJ and the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, and collaborating on the steering committee for that program, as an example. Other legislation that would create new funding streams through DOJ for this work. But more generally, I think kind of in aligning with the mission of trying to be helpful to as many people as possible as we can, and implementing our work well is trying to play a system navigation role. So I think an example is on the Medi-Cal violence prevention benefit. Last year, California became one of the first states to create, through legislation, a pathway for Medicaid to reimburse violence prevention counseling services for community violence intervention work, especially for victims of violence, people who have been chronically exposed to gun violence and are high risk for re-injury. That's a really important new funding stream. It's just in its very early days, very complicated for a lot of programs to tap into and understand a complex system of Medicaid reimbursement. But at the end of the day, it's a permanent funding stream through our health systems. It's what a public health approach to violence prevention can look like. And we're working with groups outside of government, other agencies on a working group to support implementation, help folks understand how they might be able to utilize those services, figure out if it makes sense for their programs, and plan around it.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And then the last question I'll have, and then we can transition into your presentation on some of the findings, from looking at the data. But one question that honestly, I have, and I think it's sort of enlightening to talk about a little bit is it does feel a little bit like there's been an increase in data recently and an increase in availability of data. Can you talk a little bit about why that is and what we're doing with that information?
Yeah, so some of that is a result of policy changes. So for decades, there was essentially federal laws that effectively prevented federal agencies from supporting gun violence research. I think 2020 was the first year in about 25 years that the federal government really started meaningfully investing in gun violence research. So we've started to see a lot more support, a lot more academic research, looking into what's working, what isn't, documenting some of this. California didn't wait for the federal government to change that law. We established the first state-funded academic research center, the California Fire and Violence Research Center. So a lot of great work has come out of that in the last half decade or so, and including some of the data points cited in this report. I think more generally, zooming out, there's also been a growing recognition that we need to understand better how we can effectively deploy limited state resources to people in places at highest risk. And I'm someone, I don't glamorize data for the sake of data, itself. Numbers are only numbers unless they're connected to the real world impact. So I think the importance here, and I'll come back to this over and over again, is that this is the foundation for informed and effective action to ensure that we're doing everything we can to find out who is at highest risk, where is most gun violence occurring, to understand the different factors that contribute to different types of gun violence, and to inform our actions to increase safety.
Great. So with that, Ari, I know that you prepared. So yesterday, the Office of Gun Violence Prevention released its first report, looking at some of these data sets and sort of presenting it in a way that I think makes a very compelling case for why California has had success over the last 30 or 40 years in this policy area, and I think talks about some of our challenges and some of sort of where we're going. So with that, Ari, I will turn it fully over to you to provide that presentation, and then I will reappear on your screen and we can go through some of the questions that are coming in. Thank you.
So yeah, thanks for joining today for the conversation. The data report we released yesterday aimed to provide an overview, a starting landscape analysis of the most current health and safety statistics available from publicly accessible data sources. We wanted to try to document how different forms of gun violence are impacting different communities across California. We wanted to place California's long-term reductions in gun violence and pandemic era increases in context with some national trends. And we wanted to use this data to identify some of the leading opportunities and challenges we face to inform more effective action. This is a big topic to cover in about 25 minutes, so it'll be just a condensed partial overview, lots of data visuals to guide us, and it won't just be my voice. I hope you'll take the time to read our full report though. Along with the content warning that we're talking obviously about traumatic experiences, violence, I do want to also come back to a data numbness warning too, that I know many of us know that behind these data points, we know the names, we know the people behind them, we know that no person lives or dies as a statistic. And so again, we're offering this data to try to inform action. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So here we have a guide to some of the leading publicly accessible web-based data portals that can be used to understand and document the impact of gun violence in California and at the national level. Most of the data I'm going to present today was analyzed and generated based on these sources. And I want to uplift especially the California Department of Public Health's Epicenter data portal, which includes detailed information about non-fatal gunshot injuries where the victim required hospitalization or emergency department care. That's a really unique and vital source of information about people who have survived gun violence injuries. It's not readily accessible in recent years in most other states and at the national level. So it's a really vital and unique source. I want to also kind of offer the caution that some state and federal data sources are offered with a time lag. So the 2022 data cited here is provisional. It includes about 99% of likely gun death certificates submitted to CDC and the Department of Public Health, but for 2022, but any that are submitted very late may be subject to minor revisions. And some of the other data sources cited here, like the Gun Violence Archive, provide more real-time, but somewhat less comprehensive information based on public media reports and other sources reported in real time. Next slide, please. So here we wanted to show break down the information about the nearly 70,000 gunshot wound injuries in California from 2016 to 2021. These are those that resulted either in death or required hospitalization or emergency medical care. So the fatal incidents are shown in blue. As you can see, different forms of gun violence have very different odds of lethality and death. But 92% of intentionally self-inflicted firearm injuries result in death, compared to about 27% of interpersonal assault shootings and 1% of unintentional shootings in this group. As a result, suicides are a slight plurality of gun deaths in California during this period, but life-threatening gun assaults, unintentional shootings were much more common overall. This graph doesn't capture the larger number of people who were shot at or witnessed a shooting, larger ripple effects through families and communities, but it does highlight the most grave and life-threatening or fatal gun violence incidents in our state. A few key takeaways that we're going to return to here are first, the importance of considering the needs and experiences of the thousands of Californians every year who survive gunshot injuries. For every person killed by gunshot wounds in our state, between 2 and 3 others survive those life-altering traumas. And if the same is true at the national level, we can estimate that well over 100,000 Americans are victims of gun violence each year, over 1 million in the course of a decade. A second key takeaway that we'll return to is to observe the extreme lethality of firearm suicide attempts. Next slide, please. There are really significant disparities in gun homicide rates both between and within different communities in California. So we wanted to start by showing this at the county level. This graph shows disparities in per capita gun homicide rates by county in our state. While some of our most populous counties, like Los Angeles County, have higher numbers of gun homicides overall, Los Angeles County has more people than most states. There are counties in the Central Valley, Central Coast region that have per capita gun homicide rates at least double the statewide average over this period. Next slide, please. There are also really significant disparities in gun suicide rates by county in California. 10 more rural counties in Northern California and the Sierras have gun suicide rates that are over triple the statewide average over this period. Before we delve deeper into an analysis of gun violence incidents in California, let's zoom out a bit and look at California's patterns and trends in context with the broader national context. Next slide, please. So here we see per capita gun death rates over the last 30 years in California compared to the rest of the US. That's the other 49 states and DC combined. Compared to the rest of the country, California has made really substantial long-term gains in safety and reducing gun-related deaths that stand apart from national trends. Provisional 2022 data from CDC showed that per capita gun death rates in the rest of the US were 75% higher than California's. And the rest of the US grouping is doing a lot of work there. It's combining a lot of different states. If we excluded some large states with relatively low rates of gun violence, like New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, the disparities between these graphs, these lines would be even more significant. We can see that California is not immune to broader national trends like significant pandemic era spikes in firearm deaths in 2020 and 2021. We can also see that California has made really substantial progress that stands apart from the rest of the US. And we also want to note that in 2019, this didn't get a lot of attention at the time. California had its lowest gun death rate ever recorded for the state in CDC records going back over half a century. Next slide, please. So this graph shows the same information for firearm suicide rates specifically. 30 years ago, California closely matched the rest of the nation, but not anymore. Over the last 2 decades, especially, gun suicide rates have held relatively steady in California at a time when they've risen by about 40% in the rest of the United States. And in 2019 and 2020, California had its lowest gun suicide rates on record. Next slide, please. So here we look at firearm homicide rates over the last 30 years. 30 years ago, California had a substantially higher gun homicide rates than the rest of the country, actually the 3rd highest out of all 50 states. It's important to remember this when putting California's progress in context. In the not so distant past, we were actually an extreme outlier with much higher rates of interpersonal gun violence than the rest of the United States. In the rest of the US, gun homicide rates were higher in recent years than they were 3 decades ago. That is not true in California. Even after significant pandemic era spikes, gun homicide rates were about half of what they were 30 years ago. And in 2014 and 2019, California had its lowest and 2nd lowest gun homicide rates on record. Next slide, please. This shows the same information, but for firearm homicide rates for young people, for youth under 25. Again, California had very uniquely high rates of gun homicide 3 decades ago, 3rd highest in the country for youth gun murders. It has made especially substantial progress for youth safety, stands apart from national trends. While the state made very significant progress during the 1990s, we also made pretty uninterrupted progress every year from 2006 to 2019 as well. And from 2006 to 2022, again, even after pandemic era spikes, California had cut youth gun homicide rates in half from 2006 to 2022, at a time when the rest of the US saw a 37% increase in youth gun homicides. Next slide, please. So this graph looks just at California compared to the next 2 most populous states, Texas and Florida. And we see that these states are rowing in different directions. In 2022, California's youth gun homicide rate was just over half the rate recorded in the next 2 most populous states. And we've seen significant reductions in California during a time of significant increases in both Texas and Florida. Next slide, please. If we put all this together and ask what it means, ask some what ifs, we can do some math and look at ask a question, if California rather had the same gun death rate as the rest of the United States over the last decade, our state would have lost nearly 19,000 more people to fatal gunshot wounds in just 1 decade. Tens of thousands more Californians will likely have been shot and left to grapple with life-altering injuries and traumas. And conversely, if the rest of the US had the same gun death rate as California over this decade, there would have been nearly 140,000 fewer firearm-related deaths nationwide, just in that 1 decade alone. Likely hundreds of thousands more gunshot injuries could have been prevented. So not a lot of headlines are written about the shootings that didn't happen. California's progress is incomplete, ongoing, and can be under threat. But effective implementation of gun violence prevention legislation, new programs can and often have made a world of difference to thousands upon thousands of families across our state. Next slide, please. So one important indication of the strength of our gun safety laws here in California is actually the portion of crime guns that are recovered in our state and then traced back to sellers in other states, indicating that they were trafficked in from other states, often states with weaker gun safety laws, such as no background check requirements. In 2021, the federal agency that licenses and regulates gun dealers, ATF, received about 54,000 trace requests to investigate the sale history of firearms recovered in law enforcement investigations in California that year. ATF was able to trace about 32,000 of those firearms to a purchaser and final dealer of record. As an aside, a significant portion of those remaining untraced firearms may have been untraceable because they were unserialized, privately manufactured ghost guns that would typically not have a record of sale through a licensed dealer. But of the 32,000 firearms recovered in California that could be traced to a final dealer of record, just over half were traced back to sellers located in other states. And a majority of those firearms traced to out-of-state sources were traced to dealers in just 3 other states: Texas, Nevada, and especially Arizona. Next slide, please. So here's another way of looking at this data on interstate firearm trafficking. In 2021, that same ATF data indicated that dealers in California were the source of about 2,000 firearms recovered by law enforcement in all other states and territories combined, including 203 firearms recovered in Arizona. By comparison, Arizona sellers were the source for 4,725 firearms recovered just in California alone. About 23 times more firearms flowed from Arizona sellers to law enforcement investigations in California as flowed in the opposite direction. Next slide, please. Hanging over much of the earlier discussion, all those graphs about our long-term progress, is the truth that there's also been really significant spikes in gun violence in California and at the national level during the pandemic, especially in 2020 and 2021. That's something we saw nationwide, where in 2020, the US saw the largest single-year spike in homicides on record. Causes are complex, but there's little debate, the data doesn't lie, that these spikes coincided with the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. This chart shows the number of people killed in gun homicides in California per month. We can see that from March 2020 through January 2021, gun homicides continued to climb month over month, almost continuously. California suffered 99 gun homicides in February 2020, but 199 in January 2021. Next slide, please. The onset of the pandemic also coincided with a really significant surge in gun sales. That's something we saw both at the state and federal level. This graph shows the estimated number of firearms that were legally sold in California by month based on publicly accessible FBI national background check data and related analysis from the journalist source The Trace. So early 2020 saw relatively typical levels of firearms commerce, and then March 2020 sparked something really different. The national level, March 2020 saw more firearm background check requests than any other March on record. Same was true for April 2020, and then every other month that followed through May 2021. In California, firearm sales remained at very elevated levels through early 2021. These estimates show that Californians legally bought about 800,000 firearms in 2019, but over 1.25 million in 2020. This graph is, of course, only based on estimates, again, of legally recorded firearm sales, and so it substantially undercounts the true number of firearms acquired in California over this period through illegal markets or the sale of ghost gun kits. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about ghost guns for a moment. So about a decade ago in 2013, a gunman murdered 5 people in Santa Monica, California with a homemade assault weapon he reportedly assembled from gun parts purchased online. According to news reports at the time, he failed a background check to purchase a firearm from a licensed gun dealer, but was likely never asked to pass one to purchase the gun build kit and components he used to build that untraceable murder weapon. So that was a decade ago. And in the decades since, these privately manufactured ghost guns, typically assembled from kits sold without background checks, sale records, serial numbers, or other safety precautions, proliferated at a really alarming rate across California and the rest of the United States too. In 2015, law enforcement agencies in California reported recovering 26 ghost guns in connection with suspected criminal activity. By 2021, that number grew to over 12,000. So this problem grew worse fast across the state. In 2021 and 2022, DOJ and other public officials, violence prevention groups, victims of gun violence, started initiating a series of enforcement and litigation actions in court to address this ghost gun crisis. And in 2022, California enacted comprehensive legislation to strengthen regulations of the ghost gun industry. Most of those new protections took effect halfway through 2022 at the end of June. And so the 2022 data offers some early but positive indications that these efforts have begun to slow and to reverse the proliferation of ghost guns and crimes in California. So you can see the graph on the left, the number of ghost guns recovered as crime guns in our state at least doubled every year until 2022, where it rose by 4%. And if we look at the overall number of unserialized firearms recovered as crime guns in California, 2022 saw the first decrease in about a decade. Next slide, please. Since the start of the pandemic, California has experienced a significant increase in reported hate crime incidents involving firearms. Next slide. And another concerning trend during the pandemic was a substantial increase in the number of domestic violence incidents involving firearms. There was from 2019 to 2021, there's a 2% increase in the overall number of domestic violence related 911 calls, other calls to law enforcement for assistance related to domestic violence, 2% overall increase for domestic violence calls, and 80% increase in the number of those calls that involved use or threat use of firearms. Next slide, please. At the national level, we know that domestic violence drives a significant share of violence perpetrated against women and children in particular. National data shows that in 2021, at least half of all female murder victims in the US were killed by a current or former intimate partner or family member. That's likely a substantial undercount because for an additional 20% of these homicide cases, the offender relationship was unlisted or reported as unknown. Gun violence archive data also showed significant increases during the pandemic, 65% increase in the number of minors killed or injured in domestic violence shootings nationwide. And by 2022, found that more than twice as many minors were killed or injured in domestic violence shootings in the United States compared to school shootings. Next slide, please. I want to step back and look at gun violence victimization rates by age in California. These graphs show rates of gun homicide deaths on the left and non-fatal gun assault hospitalization rates on the right. And the age distribution looks pretty similar in both graphs, with risk of victimization peaking in a person's late teen years through their late 20s and early 30s. Next slide, please. These graphs show age distribution rates for suicide and self-harm hospitalization in California by age. This slide shows it for self-harm by any method, including but not limited to firearms. As you can see, the age distribution between deaths on the left and non-fatal hospitalizations on the right is in many ways a perhaps surprising reverse mirror image. Adolescents and young adults are most likely to require hospitalization for a suicide attempt, but older adults are more likely to die by suicide. Next slide, please. When we look at this graph on self-harm with firearms in California, we see that disparate use of firearms in suicide attempts explains much of this age disparity. Older adults are much more likely to have immediate access to firearms than teens and are much more likely to use firearms in suicide attempts. Because of the unique lethality of self-inflicted firearm injuries, older adults are much more likely to die by suicide as a result. Next slide, please. To provide a bit more context, our analysis of the data from the Department of Public Health showed that firearms were used in about 3% of intentional self-harm incidents that resulted either in death or required hospitalization or emergency care. 91% of those incidents involving firearms resulted in death, compared to about 5% without a firearm. As a result, gunshot wounds were responsible for less than 1% of intentional self-harm incidents requiring hospitalization or emergency care, but 38% of all suicide deaths in our state. The majority of people who attempt suicide are able to survive that attempt or act to reverse the attempt before it's too late. But the vast majority of survivors do not go on to die by suicide. It's an important message for long-term hope and resilience. But people who reach for a firearm in a period of crisis rarely have a second chance. Next slide, please. So here we look at mass shootings. Different sources use different definitions for what constitutes a mass shooting. Under most common definitions, the mass shootings have become more frequent and higher casualty on average across the United States. 6 of the 10 deadliest shootings in modern US history occurred just from 2016 to 2022. There's also a strong link between domestic violence and mass shootings. In more than 2/3 of mass shootings, the shooter either had a history of domestic violence and or killed one or more family members or intimate partners in their mass shooting attack. And increasingly, many mass shootings have also been motivated by hateful ideologies perpetrated as acts of domestic terror and hate. Next slide, please. So looking at the gun violence archive data for mass shootings in which at least 4 people were shot. Across the US, about 1,585 people were killed in mass shootings nationwide from 2019 to 2021. Nearly 7,000 more were shot in these attacks. About 152 people were killed in mass shootings in California over this period. Over 500 more were shot. It's important to acknowledge that these mass shooting deaths, which drive much of the media discussion and narrative around gun violence for understandable reasons, represented about 3% of all gun homicides over this period at the national level. This underscores the broader, enormous societal impact of gun violence in the United States, including tens of thousands of murders that may never make the news. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about the impact of all those shootings that may not make the headlines, we have to talk very clearly about racial inequality. and socioeconomic inequality and access to safety. Because while gun violence harms all communities, its toll and traumas are just not borne evenly. This chart shows the percentage of teenage boys' deaths in the United States that were caused by gun homicide from 2020 to 2021, broken down by race and ethnicity. 5% of white, non-Hispanic teenage boys' deaths in America were caused by gun homicide during these years. That's a number that would be unheard of in nearly every other high-income country on Earth. It's similar to the number of white teenage boys who died from cancer, about 4 times as many who died from COVID-19. But the percentage of deaths caused by gun homicide rises for every other racial group, including over half of Black teenage boys' deaths in this country. And to put that another way, at the height of a global, once-in-a-century health pandemic, the parents of a Black teenage son in America were still as likely to lose their child to gun homicide as every other cause of death that would keep a parent up at night combined. These disparities were somewhat smaller, but still very substantial in California. During these years, gun homicide caused about 38% of Black teenage boys' deaths compared to 4% of white teenage boys' deaths. And these are some of the starkest examples of inequality in our country today. Next slide, please. So this shows our analysis of Californians who survived non-fatal gunshot injuries from gun assaults. So these are hospitalized survivors. Again, about 3/4 of these seriously injured gun assault patients survive. 89% of these hospitalized gun assault survivors were male. Nearly 80% were Hispanic or Black. Just over half were under the age of 30. About 3/4 were under the age of 40. Many required really significant medical attention and interventions. Nearly half were hospitalized for 5 days or more. And 3/4 received health insurance through California's Medicaid program, Medi-Cal. The vast majority were either publicly insured or uninsured, which is yet another indicator that gun violence, interpersonal gun violence, very disproportionately impacts people who have lower income, wealth, economic security, and access. So also has important implications for the role our health systems, especially Medi-Cal, play in providing tailored trauma recovery and supports to ensure that these survivors' safety and well-being over the long term. Next slide, please. As we kind of talked a little bit about in our conversation at the beginning, many survivors are at very extremely elevated risk of being shot again and killed. So a leading statewide study out of the California Crime Violence Research Center found that compared to California's statewide average, the gun homicide rate for people who had previously survived one non-fatal gun assault injury in our state was over 60 times higher, over 120 times higher for people who had survived multiple gun assault injuries in the past. Another study from a trauma center in Oakland, California, found that gun homicide was the cause of death for 79% of gun assault patients who survived the initial shooting, but then died within 5 years after being discharged from the hospital. So this has been an area where California has made some significant recent investments to change these dynamics, invest in community-based violence intervention approaches, hospital-based violence intervention programs, more aftercare supports for people who have been survivors of gun violence. There's a lot more work to do, but this is an opportunity to build violence intervention and aftercare into the public health, safety, and victim service infrastructure of our state. So that concludes our abbreviated overview of our data report. I'm going to turn it back over to Ephraim and Michael to share some of the questions we've received today.
Yeah, thank you so much for the very informative presentation, both Michael and Ari. I'd like to now open it up for questions. So at this time, Michael and Ari will be going through the Q&A box for questions. So as a reminder, just please share your question in the Q&A box on your screen so that we can collect them and answer them. If you have a question for a specific presenter, please specify that in your question. So now I'll hand it back over to Michael and Ari to go through the Q&A.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for that presentation. As we talked about, it's really compelling to see this data and see, how much of an impact we have had and how much we can and need to have in the future. I'm going to take, so I went through some of the questions. I'm going to take one or two quickly, and then Ari, I'll ask you one or two, but just to try and get through, because there are a lot of questions. First, there's a question about whether the Department of Justice would be involved in the Rahimi case. So Rahimi is a case that the United States Supreme Court just granted cert on, meaning that they're going to take a look at the question, and it'll be looked at, and there'll be arguments next year. We are not a party to that case. The case comes out of Texas. The question in that case is whether a person who's subject to a domestic violence restraining order can be prohibited from possessing firearms. So not a criminal order, but one of the, like a DVRO that we talked about, a civil court order that says that this person can't have firearms. So I can't say for certain what our involvement would be. If we were involved, it would come in the form of what's called an amicus brief, which is a friend of the court brief. Amicus briefs are commonly filed at all levels, but very much so in the United States Supreme Court. The California Department of Justice did join onto an amicus brief requesting that the Supreme Court grant cert or take a look at that case. We filed that back in April, or joined that back in April, and then the court did. So if we were involved, it would come in that form. Another question was about DVROs and GVROs and relinquishment, and what the Department of Justice is doing to address the backlog and staffing shortage. It's a great question, and exactly, I think one thing that we're doing is starting the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, which is to help coordinate and look at what the potential issues are. I mean, I think suffice it to say that this issue of relinquishment is a very big one, and one that continues to come up. What the department's APS enforcement does, the Bureau of Firearms sends agents out on sweeps, which basically means that they identify all the people who have prohibited firearms in different places and go and try and take those firearms. And then we work, those are partnerships really with local law enforcement to try and help and lift up and coordinate and do that work together. So as far as local staffing and local dedication, we don't have well, we did give out some grant money over the last 2 years to sheriffs to help them reduce their backlog, if any. And but otherwise, that money comes from the legislature and from the governor through the budget process. So we don't have money that we can give out, but we are partnering with everybody and really trying to encourage and lift up that work. Another question that we got was about federal and state funding for for community-based violence intervention. Ari, could you talk a little bit about what kind of funding is available?
Sure. Yes. It's an exciting time that there are new federal and state funding opportunities. Some of these are one-time temporary pilot approaches. So over the course of the next year or so, look out for more opportunities through the Federal Community-Based Violence Intervention Prevention Initiative, CVIPI. Likely new opportunities through the state CalVIP grant program. Some CalVIP set aside funds for programs that invest in the field of community violence intervention itself. Those are programs that train and certify violence prevention professionals, convening authority, programs that provide mental health supports to sustain violence prevention professionals in their work. Those subgrants are likely to be released in the next year or so, hopefully sooner. And there are also some exciting new one-time pilot approaches too from other agencies. A program called the Flexible Assistance for Survivors program that will provide grants for direct cash assistance to survivors of community gun violence. Other programs through the Crises Act. And I think I alluded to at the beginning earlier, a new Medi-Cal violence prevention funding stream. A lot of these are complicated, it doesn't, and small, but they're, I think, understanding which ones might work best for your program, for your community. I think helping to navigate these systems and the red tape is something that we hope to be helpful in. I'm sure I'm forgetting many other opportunities at the federal level, state level, local level. We'll be working with, we're here and looking to support and engage and provide as much information as we can.
Great. Ari, I'm going to ask you one more question if we can push time a little bit. I know we want to wrap in a minute, but I'll ask you one more question and then I'll answer one more question and then I think we'll call it. But one question that we got was about policy and action on ghost guns. So you identified ghost guns as sort of a recurring issue. What have you seen? What has the state done? What has the department done in recent years on the ghost gun issue?
Yeah, I talked about this a little bit in the data report, but it's important to come back to. It's difficult to understate how devastating the ghost gun crisis was in California. It was a crisis everywhere, but about 2/3 of ghost guns recovered from crime scenes across the country were recovered here. And in part, that's a testament to the strength of our gun safety laws. In a lot of other states, it's easy to go out and assemble an arsenal of fully assembled firearms without a background check. In California, there are a lot more steps and barriers. And so there was a lot more impetus for people who would not pass a background check, didn't want their gun sale to be tracked for some reason, to purchase these gun kits online and assemble them themselves. And we saw the proliferation and the harm, especially in fueling youth gun homicides, where young people would not be able to pass a background check because of their age. As I mentioned, the Attorney General, violence prevention groups, some local officials launched and initiated a series of civil litigation actions against some ghost gun companies for violating state and federal laws related to gun sales and consumer protection. And I think a really important change happened last year, took effect in the middle of last year. Most of its provisions took effect in June 2022 to comprehensively strengthen regulation and oversight of the ghost gun industry, start treating the sale of ghost gun products the same way we treat the sale of fully assembled firearms. And we're starting to see some positive early indications, like I said, about the impact of all of those efforts together, as well as enforcement efforts to recover legally owned ghost guns throughout the state. A lot more work and attention needs to continue to make sure that identify new attempts to work around our laws, new attempts to circumvent our gun safety laws and arm people without background checks, for instance. But this is something that DOJ is paying a lot of attention to, and I'm heartened to see that there's some early indications that the actions so far are starting to make a difference.
Great. And I'm going to try and wrap a few different questions into one last question. So we received a number of questions about in the work in schools, in rural areas, and with domestic violence in specific cities that are seeing an increase in specific areas. And, you know, what I can say about that is, you know, that's what we're trying to do. You know, I think the importance of data is that it allows us to look at these issues and find out what's going on. So obviously putting out a report that says there are this number of firearm homicides, you know, in the state of California is important because we want to track statewide, but it doesn't necessarily tell us much about what those look like. And as Ari has done in this report, and as he's talked about today, there are a lot of different types of firearm violence, and some of them look really different from each other, and some of them look a lot like each other. People who are in crisis, and our ability to affect people who are in crisis, you know, that might manifest as firearm suicide, that might manifest as a mass shooting, but the crisis scenario that they're in looks very similar. You know, there are cross sections like this and ways that we can sort of slice and reslice the data to look and see those trends and see what we can do to affect that. So I can't answer all of those questions about what we're doing in every city and rural communities right now, but suffice it to say that that is exactly the type of work that we're trying to do. And I think, you know, paraphrase it as, you know, seek first to understand. Right now, we're really started trying to take this revolution in data that we've seen, first understand, and then you know, work and try and address these solutions. We're already obviously involved in addressing these solutions, you know, at different ways, but this is sort of this is our effort to really hone in and do a better job of that. So that's all that we have to say. I'm going to turn it back over to Fran to wrap us up, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ari, for that presentation, the Q&A. And also thank you all for joining us today for the Demystifying the DOJ presentation on the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. We hope that this presentation was informative and useful to you. Please keep in contact with us. There was great engagement in the Q&A. If you didn't get your question answered, you can still contact us. Feel free to email us at care@doj.ca.gov, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. The slide deck, resources, and links mentioned in this presentation are available on our website at www.oag.ca.gov/care, and the recording of this presentation will also be available shortly. We host these presentations quarterly and have already posted our next presentation, which is scheduled for November 8th at the same time between 10 and 11, this time on the topic of housing. You can register at our website once again, oag.ca.gov/care, or at the link provided by Marco in the chat. If you're interested in watching any of our previous presentations where we have covered re-entry, reproductive rights, consumer protections, hate crimes, and our victim services unit, you can also find those recordings on our website as well. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. Take care, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.